Everyone. Uh, okay, so we are finishing up with Spinoza today, and we're looking at the appendix to part one of Spinoza's Ethics. So we're only looking at part one of the Ethics, but I think the reason to do that is that in part one we get this image of the totalized world, right? Totalized being. And in part two, we get into more sort of the nature of thought and knowledge and understanding. But for our purposes, what we're focusing on is causation. And in part one, we get this sort of total picture of causation, how causation is the center of being for Spinoza. And as I mentioned, we're going to get a very different view of causation when we start looking at Hume. And maybe if we have time, we can talk a little bit about Hume at the end of this video. But so we touched on a few of the important points from propositions 22 to 36 in our live meeting on Monday. But I want to review a few of these and touch on some points that we didn't go over. Because it's really in these final propositions that we see what Spinoza has been building this whole time. And what he's been building is a world that is entirely deterministic. He's building his determinism. And as I mentioned in class, right, we talked about this idea of determinism in class. Determinism is the idea that everything that happens in existence is predetermined, right? Has already been determined and happens necessarily. So that's one of the ideas that I want to get into a little bit more, is what Spinoza means by necessity and the relation between necessity and freedom, which is one of your paper questions. So let's think about, having introduced determinism. Let's look at a few of these propositions again. So the first point here in really arriving at this final conclusion about determinism is actually earlier. I mentioned this in class, which is the question about how bodies, how physical things can be at once finite, that is measurable, divisible from other bodies, and also as part of the one substance, as part of God, finite, infinite, right? So how can bodies be both finite and infinite? And the answer, right, had to do with the nature of infinity, the nature of infinity. A body is infinitely true in the same way that a mathematical equation is infinitely true, provided that it is viewed outside of time, right? And what we mean by that is, in the example that we used in class, the note card, right? You tear the note card, and the note card is destroyed, right? The complete note card no longer exists. So you'd say, well, that note card is obviously not infinite, right? Because it no longer exists. Its existence can't be infinite because in one moment it existed as one thing, and as in the next moment, it existed as something else. Right? A human, right, can't be infinite, right, because we are mortal, we die. So how can we say that there's infinitude that belongs to physical bodies? And as we said, right, while it's true that the note card or a human exists in one moment and not in another moment, the infinity that belongs to those bodies isn't about the temporal change from moment one to moment two. Infinity is not linear, uh, not the infinity of individual bodies. Um, right? It isn't about making it, as it were, all the way through a time series. Infinity is within each individual moment. So, right, the note card as a complete note card before it's ripped up is infinite in the moment of its being complete. And in fact, in each moment of its being complete. When the note card is ripped, it's not that the note card goes out of existence or becomes something different. It's that the moment in which the infinite and eternal unripped note card exists has given way to another moment in which there is a ripped note card. That ripped note card also is infinite, right? Both halves of the note card are infinite in that moment. So instead of thinking of infinity, again, as a line, an infinite line, infinity is an infinite number of infinite lines. Right? God is an infinite substance with infinite attributes. And what that means, right, is we get a different idea of infinity. The whole discussion about the absurdities of infinity, that it is absurd to have two infinities. Spinoza seems to be implying that far from it being absurd that there would be two infinities, the concept of infinity seems instead to contain an infinite number of infinities, insofar as an infinite thing will have infinite attributes, and each of those attributes will itself be infinite. So that when we think about infinity, we simply can't think about it in terms of measurement. To think about infinity in terms of measurement is to miss the point. Infinity is indeterminate, immeasurable. And so just to dwell on this a little bit more, this idea that infinity is, as it were, recreated anew with every moment. I'm trying to think of a better example than the note card, right? But we'll stick with it. Let's maybe we'll use Descartes' wax to keep it consistent. The idea that everything is infinite, that each body has a kind of infinitude, even though from one moment to the next within our experience, those bodies appear to change, gets at one of the more difficult questions about causation in Spinoza, which is, if you think about the wax, I have a hard piece of wax, right, with all the qualities that Descartes mentions. It smells of flowers, it, makes a noise when I hit it on the table, etc. It's hard. I put it to the candle, and the wax melts. Its color changes, it loses its scent, etc. It becomes a different body. Now, we'd say that the candle is the cause of the wax melting. That the wax melts, right, because it's held to the heat. And this is true. The candle is the efficient cause of the wax melting. Right in, I hope I've mentioned this before, but it's worth mentioning again. There are 4 chief causes in Aristotle, which Spinoza makes use of, which all philosophers make use of. And those are the formal cause, the material cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. The material cause is the material out of which a thing is made. The formal cause is the shape or essence of the thing. Right? So a hammer has a material cause of metal and wood, as a formal cause that is the shape. Right? What makes a hammer? The fact that it has a certain shape, it's made of certain material. An efficient cause, which is the thing that brings it into existence directly. Right? The tool maker is the efficient cause of the hammer. And then the final cause, which is the purpose or goal, right? The reason, the ultimate reason why a thing is brought into existence. Right? A thing is brought into existence for a specific purpose. And so that would be the final cause of a thing. In the case of the hammer, that would be to hammer, right? To hammer nails. So the efficient cause of the wax changing is the candle. But in this world that Spinoza is describing, of infinite infinities, where both the solid wax would be infinite and the melted wax would be infinite, we can't say exactly that the candle is the cause of the liquid wax. Why? Well, for the same reason that Descartes can't be the cause of the idea of perfection. And the candle can't be the cause of an infinite thing. It can't be that the infinite solid wax is held to a candle and turned into an infinite melted wax, even if the candle also is infinite. Why? Because the candle itself, as a body, is a finite thing, and a finite thing can't be the cause of an infinite thing. So insofar as the wax is infinite, its cause, what causes it to become melted, is not the candle, but again, God. So the candle is our explanation for why the wax melts. But the true cause is God, the true efficient cause. Which brings us back to that question that we've been trying to think through the whole time, right? Which is that the power needed to create something is the same power needed to sustain something. That God cannot have been only the first cause, but also must be the efficient cause. Not only the cause that sets things in motion, but the cause of every moment, the direct cause of every moment. So that when the wax becomes melted, in that moment, that wax is infinite insofar as it will always be true, and has always been true, that at that moment, the wax melts, becomes melted wax. It will always be a fact that when Descartes held wax up to the candle, it became melted wax. Truth of that melted wax is infinite. And so as such, the candle can't have been the cause of the infinite wax. The only cause can be God. And so what we get is this sort of strange combination of things, which is, on the one hand, we have a chain of causes, which is to say, determinism means that everything is determined according to its cause. And everything is determined as an effect. And everything that exists as an effect of causes, right? A necessary effect of causes, just as necessary as when I drop something, it will fall to the earth. And so the idea that everything is determined might mean that, might imply a kind of mechanical series, like a Rube Goldberg machine, or like a chain reaction, right? Think about the balls in a science museum, where the ball bearings, where you lift one up and it hits the whole chain, and the motion moves through all the balls and makes the last ball move, right? That causation is something like that. There's an initial force that sends motion through all these bodies, and so that everything that happens is a result of some first cause. And that is one way to think about it, determinism. But Spinoza has something more in mind, which is not that there is a mechanical chain of causes such that everything unfolds according to the necessary effects of, for example, the Big Bang, according to physical laws. But instead, that every moment already exists within God's essence. So it's not that there is a mechanical chain of causes that explains determinism, but instead that there's really only one cause for everything. not a chain of causes, but an infinitely existing cause, one cause. So the candle, right? What we are seeing is not a chemical reaction. I mean, we can describe it as a chemical reaction. We can explain it as a chemical reaction, right, between heat and wax. But what allows the chemical reaction to exist and for us to understand it as a cause? What's happening is really instead our experience and our perception passing from one mode of God's infinite existence to a different mode of God's infinite existence. That it's not that something, that anything acts on God or anything acts really on anything. Right? That's the key. That nothing acts on anything. The candle doesn't act on the wax. The heat doesn't act on the wax. And it's not that action that produces an effect. What ultimately causes the wax to melt is this alteration in the mode of God's existence. An alteration that is predetermined. So, I mean, this is sort of the problematic, one of the problems with this theory is that in order to grasp this, we have to think about, one way to grasp this would be to think about time as a series of moments, a series of nows, right? We have now, and then now, and then now. And that's what time is. Time is a series of moments. And each moment would represent a change in God's mode of existence. So that from now to now, from solid wax to melted wax, we don't have a relationship between those two moments that is, strictly speaking, causal. It's not, strictly speaking, that moment one, solid wax, causes moment two, melted wax, to exist. Right? Because moment two, melted wax, was already determined to exist by its being part of God's existence infinitely, eternally. Right? So that we can no more say that the candle is the cause of the melted wax than we can say that the dinosaurs are the cause of the melted wax, or that the explosion of Krakatoa is the cause of the melted wax. Anything. Because every moment is a necessary, predetermined, and infinite mode of God's existence. Between two moments, the only relation is one of identity. They are both God. So, what this implies is contradictory. Because, well, maybe not contradictory, but confusing. Because on the one hand, everything is causation. Everything is merely an effect of God, who is the one cause. But also, all causation is reducible to that one cause. So it's not quite right to say the candle causes the wax to melt. It would be more correct to say God caused there to be hard wax. God caused the wax to be held up to a candle. God caused there to be melted wax. And so what we get is the idea that on the one hand, God is made up of an infinite number of moments, right? Because just as space can be infinitely divided, if you consider space to be measurable, time also can be infinitely divided, if you consider time to be measurable. And so God would have to be an infinite series of moments. And then the question is, what's the connection between those moments? How do we understand God to be divided into moments, such that each moment would be infinite? Right? What do we gain from saying God is infinite and has infinite attributes? Why not just say God is infinite? What does the addition of infinite attributes give us? One thing we might say is that rather than conceiving of God as a series of infinite moments, we conceive of God as a single moment, an infinite moment, an indeterminate and boundless moment. With no divisibility at all. Right? And then we would say, it's not that there are three moments, solid wax, wax held up to the candle, melted wax, but that these are part of, rather than a movement, a series of moments. These are part of like a tableau, right? I think this goes back to the idea of the wall. Right? Remember the example of the wall that I gave in class, where you think about, if you look at the bottom of a wall and then scan your eyes slowly up to the ceiling, um, it appears as though things are arising, things are coming into existence because you are becoming aware of them, because they're becoming um, sensible to you. But, right, just because something is not sensible to you doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And when I'm looking at the bottom of the wall, the top of the wall still exists. It just hasn't come into my field of vision yet. So we understand the same thing about the wax. Right? When I have the solid wax, it seems as though, right, that's all there is. I can't see the future of the wax. Uh, and when I hold the wax up to the flame, I'm not acting. I'm not choosing to hold the wax up to the flame. Instead, the next part of the tableau, right, the next segment of wall is revealed to me, and I experience it. And because, right, what I experience is my body in motion, and the motion of my body corresponds to my thinking. Right, my thinking, I'm going to hold this wax up to the candle. I believe that I have chosen to do this, that I've acted. So this is the one part of part two that would be important here. That for Spinoza, just as there is a chain of causes in bodies, there's also a chain of causes in thought. And the chain of causes in thought corresponds to the chain of causes in bodies. So that, right, when I see the wax being held to the candle, I'm thinking, that's wax, that's a candle, that's the wax being held up to the candle. Right? My thought corresponds. And so my thinking is determined according to the same causes as physicality. So I may believe that I'm choosing to do this, but in fact, my thinking is also an expression of God, and my thinking is caused by God and is in correspondence with my acting. The essence here is that my action is not really my action. And change is not really change, but instead it is what is revealed to me through my senses or through my thinking. Right, and this is a very strange idea. That you aren't living your life. You're experiencing your life. You're perceiving your life. That when you act, you aren't choosing to act. You are discovering how you've been determined to act. And so this, another thing this will bring up is that question of the fundamental Cartesian idea, right? Well, if I've been determined to act, and if I'm not actually acting, then what's the difference between actually acting and perceiving myself acting? What is the perceiving part of myself to which my life is revealed, right? If I don't choose how to live, right? If I don't choose my life is rather revealed to me. Who is that I to which my life is revealed? Who is that I that has the ability to assent or withhold assent to my own life, right? To approve of what I am or to not approve of what I am? Isn't there some freedom in that I? And Spinoza will say this is, you know, the function of God in the mind, right? That we're able to have that experience to the extent that we are part of God's substance, to the extent that we exist qua God rather than qua human. But I'm not sure that's an entirely satisfactory answer. But in any case, that's a bit of a tangent. Um, so this idea then that, right, there is one movement, one cause, either turns into an infinite series of moments, each of which is infinite, or one singular infinite moment. Now, if it's an infinite series, we have to ask, how is it unified? Uh, right? How do I know that this moment, which is infinite, is related to this next moment, which is also infinite? How do I have a guarantee that there's something underlying these two moments? How do I know, for example, there isn't a new God every moment, a new God which is responsible for that infinitesimal moment? What guarantees the sameness of God from moment to moment? Or we'd say God is a singular moment, a singular movement. In fact, the word moment comes from the word movement. Um, in which case, we would imagine the universe, all of being, as a singular act, God as act, being as act. And this is what Spinoza has been getting at to some extent, right? God's essence is his power. Proposition 34, God's power is his very essence. Uh, that all of being already exists as at once the act and the effect of God's act. And this is the point that is important. Sorry. And this is preparing us for our next reading, David Hume. If God is a cause, and the cause of all things, and everything that is as an effect of God. What does God act on? A cause is a cause of something, right? God is self-caused. God acts on himself. God produces himself. But then cause and effect would be identical. God causes himself. So why do we talk about cause and effect when it comes to God? If the cause and the effect are identical, why talk about cause and effect? If the effect is contained within the cause and vice versa, why separate these? So, in some sense, it's not right to talk about God as a cause or being as an effect. We can only talk about God. Everything exists by virtue of being God. And everything that is nothing more than an infinite expression of God's power. But this challenges the idea of cause and effect. For example, if the cause of the melted wax is not the candle, but God, then there's no necessity that the heat will melt the wax. The only necessity is that God create a moment. That I could hold the wax to the candle, and perhaps at one moment it would melt, but perhaps at another moment it would not melt, because the heat is not the cause of the melting. God is the cause of the melting. And as long as I can't know God's essence or God's being, I can't know with certainty that the next time I hold the wax to the candle, there won't be some different effect, which is a product of God's essence. Right? Because the candle isn't what's ultimately doing it. Now, what then leads me to say there's causation, right? That heat melts wax, rather than uh, whatever God is. And maybe today that's a being that causes heat to melt wax, and tomorrow it would be a being who doesn't cause heat to melt wax. I can never be sure, according to this, that what was true yesterday will be true tomorrow, because it's all dependent on the necessity of God's being, which I can't know. All right. So that's going to be um, the kind of material that Hume is going to pick up, right? The intricacies of this idea of causation, especially of a self-caused being. But let's get into the appendix finally. Um, Determinism, right? The idea that there is no freedom, right? Because you are an effect. Human beings are effects of God's will, God's essence. They are not their own free causes. Um, there is no freedom, but also, more importantly, there is no mm, there is no purpose. And we touched on this in class. Uh, to the first point, this is very upsetting to many people, right? There is no human freedom. And whether you understand this through pure sort of physical, mechanical reasoning, right? Um, every physical thing is an effect of some cause. Therefore, and all effects follow necessarily from necessary physical laws. Therefore, everything that exists in the physical world exists as a necessary effect of some cause, and therefore is not contingent or free. Um, or you can understand this more theologically. Right? Say, well, because God is the efficient cause of every moment, what I choose, what I am at any moment, is is always going to be reduced to God's will. Uh, but in either case, in Spinoza's view, we have no freedom. The only agency is God's agency. Um, Now, this raises a number of paradoxes. Right? How can I, as a free being, contemplate my lack of freedom? Right? Or how can I, as an unfree being, as a determined being, have the seeming freedom to contemplate my lack of freedom? Wouldn't, in contemplating my lack of freedom, I develop the power to act freely, perhaps, to, as a thinking thing with a will? Wouldn't I be able to will myself to change my destiny, right? To be something other than what I've been determined to be? And so we have a kind of, feedback loop, we might say, um, where, yeah, um, for Spinoza, the answer is going to be, well, obviously no. Um, no matter how kind of meta your thinking gets, right? It's weird that I've been determined to think about my determinism. Why would I be caused to think about the fact that I'm caused? Why would I be caused to question my own freedom or to believe in my own freedom? Uh, None of that matters because all such questions, why is this the case? How can it be uh, that I'm not free and yet I feel I have a sense of freedom? All such questions refer to some sense of the purpose of the universe. Um, And our belief in freedom, moreover, is based, Spinoza thinks, in the belief in final ends, in there being a purpose of the universe. Freedom, human freedom, is connected necessarily to the idea of there being a purpose in life. We believe we have freedom because we have desires, because we have purposes and goals. I have a goal, and I believe I'm working toward it. Right? But in reality, that goal and final purpose is not a reality. So again, let me just say a little bit about what Spinoza thinks about thought, because, right, if I'm able to imagine I have a final purpose, wouldn't that be caused by God, right? That belief, and therefore wouldn't that be true? And it's caused by God. First of all, it can be caused by God and be an illusion. Right? Why? Well, there are illusions, and everything that exists is God, caused by God. And so illusions must be caused by God. God is not a deceiver, but just as in Descartes, God has created a world, or within God, it is possible for there to be misunderstandings and imaginary representations about God. For Spinoza, while understanding is correlated to being, right? I understand I'm holding hard wax. I understand I'm holding the wax up to the candle. I understand that the wax is now melted. My understanding corresponds to reality. But thought can also be separated from reality and can, while still remaining a part of God, move into fantasy and imagination and away from reality. So that when I am imagining a unicorn, right, I'm thinking of something that has no reality. The thought is still dependent on God and caused by God, insofar as it makes use of reality, right? It's a fantastical composition, right? A horse plus a narwhal. And in that extent, imagination is a kind of possibility for God. But imagination is not going to be reality. My imagination tells me that I have a goal, that I have a purpose. But I only believe that because there are certain things that give me pleasure and other things that give me pain. And thus, I desire pleasure and I don't desire pain. I want pleasure. But that wanting is itself a function of the imagination, insofar as it believes that it can attain something through the free will. Right? I want to be rich. Um, well, that's good, right? Sure, fine. Or maybe it's not good, but fine. The wanting to be rich has no impact on whether or not you will actually be rich. What will happen to you in your life is predetermined. That wanting is attached to your imagination about what your life might be. I want more pleasure than pain. I'm imagining a life of more pleasure than pain. But those imaginations and those wantings and that will uh, have no bearing on how things will actually play out. So the entire realm of final causes, purposes, is illusory. Uh, and all we're able to really use our will to do is, again, accept the reality in which we live or be made miserable because we imagine a life that would be better than this one. And therefore, we're discontented with the one that we have. No amount of wanting is going to change what you get. Uh, and what you can either want what you get or not. Right? You can imagine that your ideal life is the life that you have, or you can imagine some other life that you have no power to attain for yourself, at least not through free will. Right? So that is the ethics here. More generally, right, he says that this concept of final causes, purposes, the thought that we have a purpose, or that there's a purpose to existence, leads to a superstitious and dangerous concept of God. Right? Um, that God is like a human being, that God works, that God wants something, that God has a purpose, that God created being and nature for some purpose. Right? This, Spinoza thinks, is the sort of fallacy and failure of religion. Religion understands God as basically a very powerful human with all the attributes of a human, including desire and will, free will, and a purpose. And again, so we talked about this a little bit in class on Monday. The absurdity of thinking that God has purpose. Right? In order for God to have a purpose, God would have to want something. God would have to, therefore, be lacking something. Right? To want is to lack. And to say that God wants and therefore lacks something is to deny God's perfection, God's omnipotence, right? The all-powerful character of nature and being. So God cannot want, and without wanting, he can't have a purpose. Now, I thought this was kind of an interesting moment in the appendix where he's talking about this scholastic distinction between two kinds of purposes. A purpose that satisfies some internal need or lack, right? Want as a function of lack, and a purpose that aims to share what one already has with others who lack it, right? So a want as a function of abundance, right? I have something that I want to give, And therefore, right, to say that God wants would mean not necessarily that he lacks anything, but rather that he's benevolent and wants to bestow something. Um, but the problem there, again, is that in order to want to bestow something, in order to want to give something to benefit someone, there would have to be something that is separate from God, right? Uh, Anything, right? To say that there is anything that lacks anything in Spinoza's framework is the same as saying that there is something that God lacks. If God wants to give grace to human beings, it implies that right, there is a part of God, human beings, that is lacking what it ought to have. But human beings, qua God, must be complete and perfect. So they can't lack anything. In order for God to want to give something, there would have to be something separate from God, something which has autonomy from God, that God is not the cause of. Because if God is the cause of it and it lacks something, then God has not created that thing perfectly. So if God is really the cause of all things, then all things must be created perfectly and must lack nothing. So God can't want anything, not even to give some of his abundance to others. So the upshot of this is that there is no final cause, no purpose to existence. In the appendix, he writes, right? Nature has no fixed goal, and all final causes are but figments of human imagination. Right? Final causes turn nature completely upside down, but regards as an effect that which is in fact a cause. Right? It confuses cause and effect again, and so this is again getting to that difficulty about cause and effect. That because all there is cause, there can be no desired effect. Right? Being is not an effect of God as a cause. There is no effect of God ultimately. There's just God. The cause and the effect are the same. And as we'll see with Hume, if cause and effect are the same, then how can we say there's causation? So this, in addition, then, implies if there's no free will and there are no purposes in nature or human life, then, as someone mentioned in class, right, there's neither good nor evil, right? Good, bad, order, confusion, hot, cold, beauty, ugliness, all relative terms, relative in the sense of, a good or bad for humans, ugly or beautiful for me. Such terms had in the past been conceived as objective. There's an objective good. There's beauty. There's a thing that is objectively beautiful. There's right and wrong. There's good and evil. Without final purposes, there can be none of these things. Things are neither right nor wrong, good or evil, beautiful or ugly. Um, all things are equally God, and therefore equally perfect. So this is a major, thesis in the debate about the nature of evil, right? And the question of evil and whether or not God can be the cause of evil. This is an old scholastic debate. Um, and it's interesting. Maybe I've mentioned this in the past. No, maybe I haven't, right? So what I always think of when I think of this debate about whether or not God can be the cause of evil is a debate between Martin Luther and Desiderius Erasmus, two medieval 16th century philosophers. And one of Luther's arguments is, right, precisely what Spinoza is saying. Right? Everything comes from God, and therefore there can be no inherent good or evil. I think he's got some line right there. Is as much God in the church as there is in a beetle's anus, or something like that. Right? There's as much divinity in a beetle's anus as there is in a Catholic church, something along those lines. Right? And the idea being God is equally distributed among all things. To posit that there is something other than God, right? That there is evil, frankly, right? To posit that there is evil, or that there is ugliness, that there is anything bad, is to posit that either God is the cause of evil and bad things, and therefore would not be perfect or even good, or it's to posit that there is some other cause of all the pain and bad things in existence, and that therefore God is not all powerful, but is right one of the creators of existence. There must be other creators of existence who would be the creators of the evil and bad things. So if we're saying that God is all powerful, then we have to say, and the only cause of existence, we have to say that God is the cause of ugly things and evil things and painful things also. So what do we do about this? Right? How can God both be perfect and the cause of evil? Spinoza's answer is there is no evil. Evil-like purposes are a function of the human imagination. They don't exist in reality. And so again, right, ethics is not a question of avoiding evil or pursuing right. It's a question of learning to accept as necessary and perfect all the things, both good and evil, that we encounter. Now, this is a kind of nihilism. We remember nihilism from the beginning of the second meditation in Descartes' Meditations, right, where nothing is true. It's a different kind of nihilism. It's value nihilism that we get in Spinoza. The idea that all values are illusions, all values are imaginary. There is nothing good or bad. Right? And I already quoted the Hamlet line. Right? There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So Spinoza will also then say the other major illusion that's part of our thinking about God and this idea of God's goodness, God's will, God's intellect. Right? And for Spinoza, right, God actually has none of these things. God is not good. God is not um, has no will and no intellect. God doesn't need to judge between things, and so has no need for intellect as we think about it. God has no obstacle to overcome, and therefore has no need of will. And God is not good, because good is an opposite term to evil. It referred to pleasure and pain. God would not experience pleasure or pain because nothing can act on God. There's nothing that would give God pleasure or pain. So all of these are illusions. And in thinking about God this way, uh, what we do is we prevent ourselves from having an objective and scientific outlook on reality. We prevent ourselves from pursuing an understanding of reality. Right, this is what he's talking about when he's talking about right, when we're asking about the causes of things. Why did something bad happen? Why did this accident befall me? And you want an explanation for it. Right? Why do bad things happen to good people? You're looking for a cause, right? And so you might pursue a natural cause. Right? So let's see. If a stone falls from the roof on somebody's head and kills him, by this method of arguing, right, asking for the purposes of things, why does the stone fall from the roof and kill my friend? By this method of arguing, they will prove that the stone fell in order to kill the man. If there are purposes in reality, in nature, then we'd have to say, when a stone falls from the roof and kills someone, it's on purpose. God did it on purpose. For if it had not fallen for this purpose by the will of God, how could so many circumstances have chanced to concur? Right? We would say the stone falls because, of friction and weather and a number of coincidences that all align in order to produce this moment of bad luck. How does all this align? Right? What are the chances that all these coincidences would concur in order to result in this horrible conclusion? There must have been some purpose to this. Perhaps you will reply that the event occurred because the wind was blowing, the man was walking that way, right? Well, it could have just been the wind. But they will persist in asking why the wind blew at that time and why the man was walking that way at that time, right? There must be some design. If you again reply that the wind sprang up at that time because on the previous day the sea had begun to toss after a period of calm, and that the man had been invited by a friend, they will again persist, for there is no end to questions. But why did the sea toss? And why was the man invited for that time? And so you can say, look, there are all these mechanical causes. It's all just part of this system. There was no, the system is not designed to kill your friend by dropping a rock on him, right? Your friend and the rock are not so different. What befalls them is all part of a much larger plan that itself has no purpose except for to exist. And so they will go on and on, asking the causes of causes until you take refuge in the will of God. That is the sanctuary of ignorance. Right? So no matter how deep your mechanical explanation for some kind of accident or tragedy like this go, why did this happen? Well, we can trace material causes back this far. You can never answer that question. Yeah, but why were material circumstances arranged in such a way that this was the outcome? Right? If you're asking that question, why? Right? Ultimately, the only answer that satisfies is going to be the will of God. Right? But what we mean by the will of God is everything. And what Spinoza is saying is, by the will of God, we simply mean the sum total of everything that exists, and if you think that the sum total of everything that exists has as its purpose this rock falling on your friend's head, right? That's I mean, everything that Spinoza said about purposes, it doesn't make any sense. Um, but this idea of the will of God then becomes a hindrance to pursuing um, true knowledge about mechanical explanations. Right? So, um, if we say, right, um, why are the summers getting hotter? Why is California burning? More quickly. Why is California so much drier now than it was 100 years ago? Right? We might say, well, all right, well, let's. There are a lot of really complicated material causes that we need to think about and figure out. Right? We can get some kind of answer, but for those who uh, right rush to this answer of the will of God, right? Because they assume the will of God um, is not Spinoza's concept of the will of God, but instead this anthropomorphic concept of the will of God, which is that God, has free will and chooses according to a certain purpose. Then you'll say, well, it does no good to understand the material causes of things, right? Because ultimately the answer is the will of God. Right? California is getting drier because of the will of God. That's all you need to know. Right? That's always ultimately the answer. And so what Spinoza is trying to say is, look, what you mean by the will of God is nothing more. Ultimately, if we think it through to the logical conclusion, is nothing more than saying um, it happened because it happened, right? Because it existed, because God is God, which is no explanation at all. And so, by assigning intention to God, one finds an excuse not to look for material causes. And what Spinoza is saying is there is no intention to God. And so there's no harm in looking into material causes. And in fact, by looking into material causes and a chain of causes and mechanical explanations of things, we are gaining truer knowledge of God and what God really is. So it ends up as, again, a defense of science and of scientific thinking. All right. So let's conclude there with Spinoza and with these sort of religious observations that are the cap of part one. And it's this thinking that led to Spinoza's excommunication from the Jewish community and his trouble with the Catholic Church. And I think that in sort of unfolding the consequences of this idea of causation more, also, we've prepared for our next reading, which is David Hume. And with Hume, we're going to get a very different take on causation, as I've been saying. So for next class, our next meeting, we'll talk about Hume. Until then.